Good morning, everyone. According to my clock, I have 11 o'clock for a start, and I wanted to welcome you to this particular session. My name is Jean Eels. I am speaking with you from Webster City, Iowa, north central Iowa, in the United States, for those of you that might be checking in from international. I am happy to have this opportunity to share information with you in a symposium. Fortunately, it's not just me talking to you the whole time. I have two other guests who are going to share information with you, but I want to give you a little bit of context about the symposium that we've chosen to share with you today and help you understand the context within which this work has been placed. So I am first off, woman farmland owner. I share land with my siblings, and it was a kind of small old McDonald type farm with cattle, hogs, oats, hay, a number of things when I was growing up. And I wanted to understand how, when I started my career in conservation education, how women were doing conservation. So I started doing conservation outreach and always had some women at programs, never intended to exclude them, but I noticed that they weren't present in conservation activities when I became a Soil and Water Conservation District Commissioner. And in 2002, after some service with the State Soil Conservation Committee in Iowa, I learned that women owned or co-owned half the land in Iowa, and that set me on the path to understanding more about how we can do conservation outreach and how we can improve our conservation outreach and our outcomes in conservation by engaging more people. I set out on some PhD work in 2002 to try and figure out why it was that we were not engaging women as effectively as we could to get to better conservation outcomes. So I finished a PhD in 2008 and have spent the time since then working to apply what I learned about institutional gaps and how we can better engage women farmland owners in active conservation roles. Of course, that engages women farmers and producers, but it's more than just women farmers and producers that we're talking about. So I've had the privilege of working with a variety of private nonprofit organizations. I've worked with NRCS and IDOLS and all of the folks, FSA, that work in the conservation world. And I personally have been in front of more than 3,500 women farmland owners and women farmers in more than 20 states. And have listened and heard and been part of ongoing research based on a variety of funders and a variety of projects. And that's where I'm bringing you some of the information and engaging in the discussion we have today so that we might be able to move the needle for conservation and make improvements. So I'd like to thank the Soil and Water Conservation Society first for recognition for Conservation Professional of the Year. I really appreciate the recognition of this subject because this has been what I've been working on for so long. And then also the Women in NRCS Conservationist of the Year. Recognition, again, of the importance of this work in reaching women to improve our conservation outcomes. So with that introduction, we will have two speakers, then myself. We'll each present about a 20-minute PowerPoint, and we'll have about 5 minutes of question and answer after those two speakers. Then after I conclude my presentation, then we will open up for question and answer for as long as you have questions to answer. And we'll just engage in a more wide-ranging discussion. If you have questions, please put them in the chat and we'll do our best to answer those as we go. But with that, I think I will be turning this over to Ed Lauderman. He is going to share his presentation with us, and he's going to introduce himself to you so that you'll know more about who our speakers are. Thank you, Ed.
Thank you very much, Jean. I'm Ed Lauderman. I'm coming to you from St. Paul, Minnesota, where we've just had a nice couple of tenths of rain. I'm an economist and a writer, but I'm also a farm boy growing up on a farm in southwest Minnesota, really much more like eastern South Dakota. And I consider myself a farmer because I still own a Massey Ferguson tractor and some machinery, and I fix a lot of fence. But USDA considers me a NOLO, and Dan Zinkin will get into what a non-operating landowner is. The land is actually worked by my cousins who've rented it for some years, and the pastures with the neighbor. But I'd like to talk about the case study of my mother. And the title is, our policy is that we simply do not make loans to women. And this was a key moment for her when she was in a situation in her mid-40s in 1957 when she needed to buy a farm and operate it herself or have to give up the dream she had. And so it's a case study of a woman who successfully struggled against gender discrimination in Minnesota in the last half of the 20th century. We're cutting to the end of the story here, and that her struggle was a success. And she worked really to create and to build a successful Southwest Minnesota crop livestock operation. She operated it, I operated it. Now my cousins have been operating it. But it's a productive farm, and it's also one with good soil and water conservation measures that have been implemented and maintained over time. In 1957, Anna faced some challenges. She needed financing to purchase a 420-acre farm that she had been living on with her children, and she had been doing some farming on, but it didn't belong to her. The owner died, and she needed to either buy it to continue her dream or to move off and give up. But not only did she have to buy it, she had to improve it from 35 acres of cropland to the 280 it eventually had. And yet she had to conserve soil and water in a very complex ecosystem. The first challenge was to get the money. She went to the Federal Land Bank, which is a government-sponsored farm finance agency that made mortgage loans. And she talked to a Mr. DeBates, who was really a wonderful man. He was not a bigot or anything, but his response is his cordial response to her question or her asking for a loan was, "I am sorry, Mrs. Lauderman, but our policy is that we simply do not make loans to women." Now, there were no any fairness in lending laws in that time. And so what he did was entirely legal, and it was a common practice. Nearly every other lender would have said the same thing. Now, the second challenge she had was to get the help of what was then called the Soil Conservation Service, now the Natural Resource Conservation Service. She needed technical help, she needed engineering design, she needed cost sharing, because to develop the farm, it clearly needed some soil conservation measures, including grassed waterways, terraces, windbreaks, and a number of other things. And she approached the director of the Soil Conservation Service office in Murray County, Minnesota, and expressed her interest and needs. And he responded cordially, but he was a bit skeptical. And then she said this: "In 1935, we had to light the kerosene lamps in the middle of the day in my schoolhouse in Sioux County, Iowa, because all the dirt from Kansas was blowing over." And this is a picture she took of that schoolhouse without a flash. It's with a little pasteboard Kodak camera. And her students, the boys have their feet up on the desk. But this was during the day. The glow is from, they actually had a gas mental lantern also. But they had, for days on end, they had to put the lamps on in the school in the middle of the day to be able to see. Now, she was successful. There were some key factors. She was a very unusual person, a very complex person. But she had a very strong personality with great determination. She had made her own way in the world from age 14 on, when she had left home to go to a boarding high school. And she gained enormous experience in her 30 years away from the tall grass prairie, going from Minnesota to Iowa to California to New York City to Washington, D.C., back to California to Grand Rapids, Michigan, and then back to Minnesota. And she gained a lot of experience along the way. She's the little girl in the middle. She's about 1 year old. These three are the oldest three children of immigrants from the Netherlands who had been there about 8 years at the time that this was taken. And I would place this at a couple of months before the outbreak of World War I. This is the family taken some years later, and there probably, you could find 100,000 photographs like this, whether people came from Czechoslovakia or Norway or Sweden or Germany, whatever. But immigrant parents born in the 1870s, 5 children born here. Some would farm their entire lives. Some would leave the farm. One got a doctorate, one got a master's degree. My mother got an associate's degree and taught school. But this was taken the day of her graduation from country school, from graduating the 8th grade. And she was going off in the fall to a denominational, a church-run boarding high school about 70 miles south in Sioux County, Iowa, in the county seat of Orange City. And when she went there at age 14, she never lived on the farm again. She came back during some vacation times for visits, but she never lived on that farm again, nor in the valley, the Chanoramby Valley of southwest Minnesota, until she returned as a widow in the early 1950s. Mom was comfortable in dresses as a college student, but her favorite wear actually would have been a pair of overalls and some boots and a cap. She was mechanically minded. Here she is tooling her 2 younger sisters around in their brother's Model T. And about 3 years after that, she had one of her own that she purchased for $25, and she was proud to say it had an electric starter. Here she is doing chores on her parents' farm. This is actually one that her parents moved to, a smaller one, when her brother married and took over the farm on which most of the photographs are taken. And Mom was an all-around farmer, but she had a special love for livestock, and she's a farmer who really liked doing chores. Again, she liked animals. She liked horses. She could drive a team of horses, and she could harness them when she was 9 years old. But this photo is taken because she's standing on her family's farm, but at the very edge of it. And this shows the Chanoramby Valley it drains the Buffalo Ridge of southwestern Minnesota. This is the little bit of Minnesota that's in the Missouri River Basin, not in the Mississippi or St. Lawrence or Red River, the North Basins. And all the land behind her that you can see is land that 25 years after this, she would own. And where she would live for all but the last few of the next years of her life until her dying in 2003. Now, she went to 4 years of a boarding church high school in Iowa, got a 2-year associate's degree, and like her mother, took over teaching a country school. This is the schoolhouse, Holland Township, number 4, north of Orange City, Iowa. For Iowans, it's just a mile or so south of Highway 18, east of Hull. And these are our students on a day when the dirt from Kansas is not blowing over. She taught there about 4 years, but she had an urge to travel, and so she moved to Los Angeles, where she taught 2nd grade for several years. in a Los Angeles suburb. It was then a detached farming town a few miles to the east of Los Angeles, where there were Portuguese and Dutch dairy farmers. Now it's an inner ring suburb of Los Angeles. But she taught second grade there and loved teaching. But the war came along. Now, this isn't her. The war came along, and she finished out the semester after Pearl Harbor, the spring semester, but immediately went to work for Douglas Aircraft in Long Beach, building B-17 bombers. And taking a camera anywhere near that plant during the war by an employee was strictly prohibited. So there are no pictures of her or the plant. This is a highly staged professional photograph showing work at Douglas Aircraft. But this is what she did. She did a lot of riveting sheet metal work. Eventually, she was the team leader for a group of about 12 people. And into her 70s, she remained very good at sheet metal work. But she moved on from occupation to occupation and challenge to challenge. After about nearly 3 years of work in the aircraft factory, she followed her younger sister into the Navy. And she was a woman accepted for volunteer emergency service, or WAVE. Here she is on her graduation from basic training, which was held at Hunter College, a women's college in Manhattan that was taken over by the Navy as a training institution, basic training post during World War II. Here she is with other proud graduates, and the World War II whacks and waves did break a lot of trail for women who followed. It wasn't easy. Then she had training as a nurse's aide at Bethesda Naval Medical Center near Washington, D.C. Here's proud graduating group, and Mom said they didn't really know what they were going off to see. Her comment also on seeing this was saying that the nurse who in charge was a real battle axe. So Mom was immediately after her training sent back out to California, to a city about 70 miles east of downtown LA. It was a hot spring spa that the Navy had taken over for a Navy hospital, and nearly all the patients had tuberculosis. And most of Mom's patients were Marines. The Navy takes medical care of the Marines. So she had sailors and she had Marines, but the Marines had caught a very virulent forms of tuberculosis in the Southern Pacific, the Southwest Pacific, Guadalcanal, the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and so forth. And this was at least 7 years before there was any antibiotic that was effective against tuberculosis. And so a lot of the people died. It was a very virulent type of tuberculosis. And Mom attended the deaths of many Marines. Now, it was very transmissible. And so the nurses and nurses' aides also got it. And the last 6 or 8 months she was at the hospital, her duty was to take care of a ward where her colleagues, nurses and nurses' aides who she had worked with, were patients. She took the picture. The woman standing arms akimbo in the middle is one of her colleagues. And then there are 3 nurses who are patients. And when Mom showed us these pictures, she would point out ones that had died. And the young woman in the middle who is smiling died some months after this. The war ended. She was discharged from the Navy. Had to re-begin a career. She did not want to go back to being a spinster school marm. She didn't want a family. She met a widower 15 years older than her, married him, and soon had a baby daughter, my sister. Here he's holding her proudly. And then she was pregnant again, but 10 weeks into the pregnancy, he had a heart attack and died very suddenly. So there she was, a widow, pregnant, and with a 17-month-old or so. And she had to make decisions in life. This was in Grand Rapids, Michigan. She was pretty much alone. So she moved back to Minnesota. Her brother was on the home place. Her sister and her sister's husband were on the next quarter north of that. And there was a large but undeveloped farm just to the south of the home place, owned by a Dutch bachelor who had been the Rotherham's mom's family's neighbor when she was growing up. He was not doing much farming anymore. He needed someone to help take care of the house. She became a housekeeper. We lived in the house. He paid her a monthly stipend. But most importantly, she had the use of a good-sized barn, 48 by 60 feet. She had use of 22 acres of pasture. She had access to slough hay, to wild hay in the valley bottom. And so she started a small dairy herd. She typically would have from 5 to 9 cows that she milked, first by hand for several years. But she pasteurized and bottled the milk and had a little route in the closest town. And this shows us when she's still, before she owns the farm, there are very few photos with her in them because she was always the person with the camera. But a Navy buddy, another nurse, had come to visit, and Mom was showing her the farm. We were standing on the hills overlooking the valley, and the friend's mother took this photo. This is of my sister and me. This was taken the same day, probably about the late summer of 1955. And I include it because it shows the topography. It's very rich land, but it's a valley bottom, and then there are hills on top, and there's about 100 feet of separation between the top fields and the bottom fields. And so that presented some very strong challenges in terms of preserving soil and water as you developed a farm. And these are the buildings, which were quite good for the mid-50s, but the newest one was 40 years old. I include a shot of a USGS topographic map for those of you who are familiar with reading such maps, just to show you the degree of slope on the sides of the valley. There are many fields very flat, flat as a pool table in the bottom of the valley, but then there are very steep hills on each side. And this is, there's 110 feet from top of hill to bottom. And I also tell people when I leave the farm and drive back to St. Paul, I drop 1,000 feet from our farm to downtown St. Paul, Minnesota. And you only drop another 700 from St. Paul to the Gulf of Mexico going down the Mississippi. Here's an aerial photograph from FSA that shows essentially the same things. This was in the 1970s. It was rich land, it was undeveloped, and Mom developed it. And that means doing some things that would not be thought good today, including some stream channelization and drainage of wetlands. But here is her initial project. She got the funding to buy the farm. She got funding to start installing tile. And this was put in within, this was work done perhaps 3 weeks after the conversation with the SAS technician. And later in that summer, they would start on some waterways and on some terraces. Now we fast forward about 10 years. Here she is talking with her nephew, her brother to whom she was very close, his son. And at first we rented out some of the land, including to her brother. Then when I was in high school, we got a 60 horsepower Massey Ferguson 180, and we farmed more and more ourselves. She had the first 6-row 30-inch John Deere corn planter sold in that county. But then I was in the Army after high school, and she rented land back to her brother again and his sons. And here she is conferring with one of them about planting for the spring. Now this shows the size and technology of the era. They didn't have enough silo capacity on their farm where their dairy herd was. A dairy herd at that time of about 50. So they would fill one of our little silos, and then he would come and fork it out by hand and take it home on a trailer like this. Their largest tractor was 45 horsepower. Ours was about 58. And when I got out of the Army back from Vietnam, I used my savings to buy a 100 horsepower Alice Chalmers. Now we're fast forwarding a long time. This is 2002. Mom is in a Minnesota veterans home in Laverne, Minnesota, just east of Sioux Falls. She would die about 18 months later. With her is her younger sister and her younger sister's husband. And the three of them are together. This picture is important to us and to our cousins because all three of these people served in World War II in the Navy, and they had great pride in the Navy. and I think were a little skeptical when I went in the Army. But my mother had been enlisted, a corpsman or nurse's aide. Her sister and her husband had been commissioned. Now, between the initial conversations and struggles and fights and cajoling to get financing and to get assistance with soil and water conservation, the farm was developed into a very productive and very sustainably managed farm. This is Google Earth from a few years ago, showing the layout of the fields. We've made some changes since then. We leveled out put in some sediment retention basins in here and straightened out what had been an old railroad right-of-way. But you can see riparian strips. You can see trees, CRP riparian strips, trees. One of the terraces along here, there are waterways along this side and back in here. Extensive additions to windbreaks and just a lot of a lot of measures that were done with the cooperation of the Soil Conservation Service. And I think this picture was taken after my mom passed away. She passed away on Christmas Day of 2003. Her father had died on Christmas Day, and she was determined to make it that long. But this shows the Chanarambe Creek, which runs through the farm. And when we took it over, there were eroding banks, and it's still a very highly stressed waterway because of the intensive agriculture, and now because of not only sedimentation, but chemical residues. But this is as it is now. There's no stream bank erosion. We have the riparian strips on both sides, and but there are productive fields behind and on top of the hill, and there are pastures that are being very sustainably managed. One of the last things we implemented with the NRCS cost share for the EQIP program, we implemented a system of rotation grazing in 2010, and that involved me putting in about a mile of high tensile wire fencing and 4,000 feet of water line so that we could have water in tanks available at each of the seven paddocks that we added. Another measure of what I think of as the health of the ecosystem is that all the little stream through the farm is highly stressed. We've always had beavers in it, and beavers are immensely frustrating if you're trying to establish riparian strips with trees. But when you come across a tree like this that beavers have been gnawing on, you can console yourself. You've lost a tree, but you can console yourself that beavers still are able to live in this stream. Some lessons from Mom's experience. Gender discrimination permeated all institutions in Sector 70 years ago. And it was not so much outright hostility as Mom being patronized, dismissed, and ignored. And it's become somewhat more nuanced or subtle, but in rural areas as well as urban, gender discrimination still permeates many institutions. And discrimination can be overcome by force of personality, which Mom did, but it took a toll, and you can't expect you can't be content with everyone having to make the sort of struggle that she had to make. Change is mostly achieved by women from the bottom up, but it can benefit from progress in attitudes and practices at the top. And I should mention that I've focused here on securing financing and on getting the assistance from Soil Conservation Service or NRCS. But Mom had a struggle with implement dealers. She had a struggle with fertilizer suppliers, nearly anyone she did business with. And eventually she developed good working relationships with some of all of these. Now, some people she simply had to cut doing any business with because they were not going to go around. But change is achievable. But if you're going beyond fighting for a better position for yourself as an individual, within existing structures to trying to change structures and underlying attitudes. This is deeply threatening to many, and reactions can be vicious and bitter. The final note is just however frustrating struggles like this for a woman trying to farm may be, there's an old saying from an old promise from 12-step groups. When we look back, we will see how far we have come. And I think if Mom could talk to you today, she would emphasize how far she came as well as the depth of the struggle she faced.
Thank you, Ed. That's great. It's nice to have some historic context, considering how far we have come. A lot of times we forget to look back and think about how much challenge women on the land have faced and how much they have worked to get some things. And your mother certainly was a remarkable person and a force to be reckoned with, which gave her certainly a leg up in being able to address the challenges. If anybody has questions, so we've got a comment. Thank you for sharing this story. It was really fascinating. She was a stout woman. I'm really pleased, Ed, that you were able to share that, and certainly enjoyed understanding that she brought a lot of skills to the table from her military service as well as certainly her early farm upbringing, all of which gave her lots of advantages in being able to start to tilt at those windmills successfully and get what she needed. So I appreciate that. So yeah, go ahead, Ed.
Well, I'm just looking at one of the comments from Zarnicki. Mom, and partly to Eugene, Mom was a force of nature. Mom had learned from all of her experiences, and attending the deaths of many people had given her some motivation in terms of life being short. And if you wanted to achieve what you really wanted to do, then you had to put forth an effort. Now, I also have to say, when I say she had a strong personality, that's a polite way of saying it wasn't always easy being her child or her brother. But one thing that we got really after she passed, not so much from women her age, but the daughters of women her age who came up to me and my sister and said, "Your mother cleared a path for other women in this community." And I think that is a real accomplishment.
I agree. Certainly a real accomplishment. And I'm glad you brought up the emotional toll, because it does take a toll. It's like a death by 1,000 cuts. And that's one of the things that certainly we do need to address in conservation agriculture and bringing people along. So with that, we're going to, with that historic context, we're going to take a look into the future. And we're going to pull up Dan Zinkin's presentation and have him share what his observations are in terms of what the present day situation is in the landscape. So take it away, Dan.
Thank you, Jean. I, like Ed and Jean, am roommate, located remotely. I'm in Salem, Oregon, which is about 55 miles south of Portland. Even though I live in Oregon, I'm an Iowa native. I have a Sioux County connection, just like Ed's mother. I was born and raised in Northwest Iowa, where my dad taught at a small liberal arts college, one of the few in the U.S. that has a farm. And Ed and I actually met in the early 80s when he was teaching at the college. And I certainly remember back then how much respect and how much my dad enjoyed talking with Ed. And so it's been good to be able to connect with him again. And also with Jean, who I met just 2 years ago at the Soil and Water Conservation Society. meeting in Pittsburgh. Just a disclaimer, my presentation reflects my views. They're not those of the society. They're not those of the society's Oregon chapter, where I recently was elevated to be president. And there's certainly not any the views of any of my clients, though they may agree with some of this. Briefly, I have spent 31 years in agricultural communications. That includes working for ag media, non-ag media, and more recently with soil health, cover crops. And I've always been fascinated with farmer decision making and why farmers do things. So just like Ed shared, I think my work reflects the experience of my parents. My mother grew up during the Dust Bowl, spent all of the 1930s on a rented farm about 30 miles from Topeka, Kansas. My mom, who just died early last year, was very proud that she was among the first people in our town of Sioux Center, Iowa, to train to become emergency medical technicians, because up until 1972, there was no ambulance service and no one staffing that in our community. And we all know in agriculture, unfortunately, there are some pretty serious accidents. Another thing that stuck out for me from my mother's experience, just until a few weeks before she died early last year, my mother just took great delight in sharing her love of the farm. Those were not easy times. I never heard from my mom, only from my dad, that during the Dust Bowl, dirt seeped into the house where they live. And although my maternal grandmother, my mom's mom, was I think a very dedicated cook and mom, farm wife, all that, I think the fact that the dirt came in was something that probably was a matter of shame and embarrassment. So it's not something I ever heard my mother talk about. My dad was born and raised in Long Island, outside of New York City. He was a man of many talents. He was a classical languages professor, a carpenter, and a wordsmith, which is definitely where I get my attention to detail and what words mean and how they affect us. He was also someone who served at many country churches, primarily in Iowa, Minnesota, and the Dakotas. When someone was sick or on vacation or moved on to another church, my dad was often called to come on a Sunday. So how did I, as a middle-aged guy who grew up in Northwest Iowa, come to have an interest or become involved in some of these principles of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion? I can trace that back, I think, to the winter of 1969, 1970. We'd moved back to Northwest Iowa from Philadelphia. It was a very cold winter, and my oldest sister, Jeannie, who was just 5 years older than I have two older sisters and two younger, was not at all impressed with the high school policy where other boys in high school, the boys in high schools could wear jeans, but the girls were required to wear dresses and nylons. And anyone who knew my late sister knew she was a force of nature. So it was no surprise when she protested to the high school principal and said, essentially, well, that's not fair or equal. I don't remember the outcome of that discussion or conflict or debate. I'm guessing she probably lost, but my sister was someone who would stand up for what she believed in. And that's something I should have remembered in the summer of 1970. My dad was putting in concrete, which he had me mix the cement, the sand, the water, and then wheel out with a wheelbarrow. It was kind of a laborious process, but it was less than buying ready mix. And so that's what we're doing. When my oldest sister, Jeannie, found out that dad was paying me 25 cents an hour, she asked me, why are you getting paid? And we four girls are not getting paid for helping mom with housework. I have to say, in retrospect, my response was pretty sexist. I think it was ghastly to say, well, this is men's work and that's women's work. A word to the wise. When you have four sisters, it's time to listen and learn. Certainly, my sister was not impressed with my response. She didn't think it was fair and she didn't think it was equal. So those are lessons that have stuck with me from a very young age. So how does that bring us to climate change and justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion today? In my reading of messages about climate change from the government, from business, from NGOs, they almost always focus on farmers. They occasionally will mention forest land owners, but they rarely refer to landowners. They may discuss landowners in the context of a renter having to have an attestation from the landowner that they have decision-making power, as I understand it, to enter into a carbon program. But by and large, the messaging does not include landowners, and I think that's a mistake. So how did we get there? If you look at many of the publications from USDA, particularly the Economic Research Service, you're going to find a reference to landlords, absent landlords, and to NOLOs, non-operating land owners. How much land are we talking about owned by people who aren't farming it and rent it out to farming? Well, we can quickly get to that using their figures. So we have 39% of the farm acreage in the lower 48's rented, 80% owned by their term landlords, not mine, who don't operate the farms. Let's move on to this point. So we've got about 355 million acres in the contiguous US 48 states that's owned and rented out. If you take the 80% from ERS, that gets you up to 284 million acres. I think it's good to stop and just say, how much land is that? That's all of California, which has got about 105 million acres. From Iowa, 36 million. Illinois almost has exact same acreage, 36 million. All total, California, Iowa, Illinois, Missouri, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Delaware, New Jersey, New Hampshire is just over 284 million acres, 285.5. So why do I believe we should include landowners who don't farm? One, obviously, they own 284 million acres of farmland that people want to rent and do. Two, I believe we should respect private property. And three, if we're going to make progress to mitigate climate change in my lifetime, we need to include everyone. And that would be farmers, farmers who are operators, farmers who rent, landowners who don't farm but rent out their land. To me, that's just a no-brainer. Unfortunately, USDA ERS views owners of private property as deficient. They define owners as NOLOs, non-operating landowners. I think it's important that we define people by who they are so we have a better understanding of how they'll act and the messages they respond to, instead of defining people by who they are not. USDA ERS also uses landlords, not landowners. I mean, think about this. We're in 2021 and USDA, a public federal agency, is using landlords, not landowners. This is dated, this is imprecise, and that's sexist. So what? Okay, in Iowa, my home state, Jean's home state, as she mentioned earlier, 47% of the farmland is owned or co-owned by women. So we have just over 30 million acres of farmland in Iowa, as defined by Iowa State and the census. All right, here's the big so what. What's the value of that 47%? Very conservatively, if you use the 2020 Iowa State University Land Value Survey of all the land, average value per acre is 75.59. That puts you up to 108.5 billion. Now, earlier this year, there was a mistaken report that Bill Gates and Melinda French Gates were the single largest individual owners of farmland in the US at 242,000 acres. And that's just wrong. There are many people who own 1 million acres or more of ranch land, and that's certainly under the definition of farmland in the view of USDA. So we've got this media maelstrom and hysteria that has ensued from this report of the Gates owning 242,000 acres. And in Iowa, it's well over 14 million. And certainly, I think if we were to look at other states, that would even go higher. I would say that women who collectively own or co-own $108 billion of Iowa farmland are the most ignored billionaires in America. I think to move on and wrap this up, if we're going to mitigate climate change anytime soon, we need to include everyone. That's farmers that own and farmers that rent. That's owners of land who rent to farmers. Secondly, I think it's just really obvious that we need to drop dated, imprecise, and sexist terms. And in fairness to USDA and USDA or ERS, that's a widespread usage of landlords. And so if you're USDA or an NGO who wants to work with landowners and achieve progress on conservation, just because USDA uses landlords doesn't really make it, I would say, right, or it doesn't really make it effective for you in your work with landowners, both women who own land and men who own land and rent it out to people who want to do that. I think the other thing is the idea of this NOLO, as if we needed another acronym in agriculture, but to define people who own private property as non-operating landowners disrespects both the men and the women and the men who own farmland. And I think we also have to be aware of what I think is this fixed mentality versus the growth mentality, and this idea of kind of what I'd call a zero-sum game. This idea that if we include landowners in this discussion of climate change, that the farmer may get less, or vice versa. I think this is such an important issue, we have to include everyone. And I think landowners may see the value of no-till, strip-till, and cover crops, which have a current payment level in private carbon programs, even when a renter, a year-to-year renter, may not see the payback from using cover crops. Last year at the Society's conference, Minnesota cover crop agronomist TJ Cardis made this excellent point that in agriculture, farmers routinely service their combines after harvest. They make sure that $400,000 or $500,000 combine goes into the machine shed and is protected from the winter, the snow, the freeze, the sleet, all that. But as TJ Cardis also noted, that we have land in the Corn Belt that's often valued at $10,000 or more an acre. And I think this is an important point, because as long as USDA, ERS, and other people look at private property owners as non-operators, they're really missing an opportunity to understand who these people are and some of their motivations and why they may take actions to mitigate climate change. These people are investors. As Gene has shared with me, many of these people who own farmland, both women and men, are getting older. It's a very typical strategy in wealth management to become less and less risky as you get older. Certainly protecting farmland with cover crops that often will cost less than 1% of the value of that farmland to seed the cover crop, to terminate the cover crop. That is just a pretty conservative, sound financial strategy. If you're not familiar with the work of Canadian Joanne Thomas-Yukato, is now working in Europe. She's a gender finance expert. She's written many books, one of which I shared with Gene, called The Gender Intelligent Retailer. And Joanne makes this great point of, if you make it women friendly, you make it everybody friendly. And I can tell you from personal experience with 4 sisters, if you don't make it women friendly, it's not going to be very easy to make progress on many issues. Just recently, I was back in the Midwest. It was great to see farmers, people I knew from state and federal ag agencies, and I had an opportunity to visit with people in one of the USDA farm service centers. And for the first time, I really paid attention to one of the posters that you typically see in the USDA service center in many of our counties. It's the one with the Statue of Liberty at top, and it says, in accordance with federal law and USDA civil rights regulations and policies, this institution is prohibited from discriminating on the basis of race, color, national origin, sex, religious creed, disability, age, political beliefs, or reprisal of retaliation for private civil rights activity. The first thing that caught my eye in that poster wasn't the verbiage, which I agree with what they're saying. It was this image. And to me, the Statue of Liberty takes on very personal meaning. My dad's father, Philip Edward Zinkan, came to the United States at the age of 17 with his family from Germany. He knew just a few words of English when he came. What shall we do? Very poignant words for someone just uprooted from his relatives outside of Frankfurt. But I think beyond that, when we think about these issues of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, I think there's some people are going to dismiss this as, well, that's just a trend. That's just being politically correct. For me, I think with my family's experience going back on my dad's side to France, it takes on even new meaning, because several hundred years ago, the Zincan name was Sican, and they were Huguenots who lived in France. And when people were getting killed for their religious beliefs in France, the Huguenots, some fled to the Netherlands and others fled to Germany, where my family settled. In conclusion, I would like to thank the Society for including this track, Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, in this year's conference, and the opportunity to present with my colleagues, Jean and Ed. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Appreciate your context and sharing the information that you did with having looked at ag conservation from your years of service in ag communications. So thanks for that setting. I'm going to give Ed a chance to answer one of the questions that we can see in chat as to where was your farm. Ed, if you can at least pop in and just say that before I start my presentation.
Yes, the farm is in Murray County, Minnesota. The closest town is the small town of Chandler, a population of about 300. Slayton would be the county seat, and a nearby town, the next county over, would be Pipestone, where there's a national monument where Pipestone was quarried. Another way of saying it is 52 miles from the hog unloading chutes at John Morell and Sioux Falls, which is now Smithfield. I also just want to say one thing in reaction to Dan. There's, in terms of global warming, on the ridge where we live is very windy, and it's the center of wind power development for Minnesota. And there are some interesting conflicts that arise, both in terms of policy, USDA policy and Minnesota DNR policy, about things like tall grass prairie restoration, but then having wind easements. And we face some hard questions about, what are we willing to sacrifice, perhaps, in terms of some visual amenity of well-conserved, landscapes, but also, say generate solar or wind power. And I'll just pass on that. But I hope I've answered the question on where the farm was.
Thank you. Thank you, Ed. Okay, so we'll go on to, I'll present a little bit about who is missing from our conversations and how I've seen that come to be. So let me see if I'm getting just a second. Okay. So we've talked about women as landowners who are often omitted from just about everything, not expected to do anything and not expected to have very much opinion or action that they can take. And I would submit that women landowners can be a force for good, and we have just simply missed working with them. And so I think during this conference, we've certainly heard a lot of presentations about research that's been going on, and it's not a real big stretch to, talk about the fact that we don't have great water quality and that not a lot of farmers are necessarily engaging with conservation. And I would say it's also probably not a big stretch to say that it's not a very fair fight. And part of it is who we think is helping. If we always think in terms of farmers and producers, we're still kind of going at it with one arm tied behind our back. We need to look at who else is out there on the landscape that can help us, who are decision makers, who have an opportunity to influence, and think about what kind of influence they can apply and who might be able to, who can we enlist to help us and work a little further on conservation. And so one of the things that I know from 12 years of work on this is that when we've done Women Caring for the Land meetings through Women Food and Agriculture Network, in any state, whether it's, small farm, Wisconsin or Maine, to, Illinois, where women will show up who have 10,000 acres of corn, they take action. And this has been independently verified. It's not just my personal experience, but 60 to 70% of the women will take action after a one-day meeting. They are so overlooked and so ignored that when they find out information and things that they can act on, they make change. So they make change when they know they have a problem. If we continue to go on ignoring having conversations directly with women, they'll assume that their land is the same as everybody else's and that it's okay. Well, what they don't know is that it may be the same as everybody else's and that we all need to make some major changes. They need to know that they have a problem. They need to know what to do, and they'll make change. They don't know what it is that they as landowners can do. We talk all the time about what producers and farmers can do. The other thing we know is that they will make change when they know others like themselves have done that. They need to see themselves as role models. So I'll go back up a little bit and say, what institution? I'm going to talk about institutional gaps. And broadly, I'm saying we. It's any form of agricultural conservation service delivery. That's the institution of ag conservation. And we'll talk about the institutional gaps. When we come from education, I have a long career in education, and I know that a lot of times learners will rise to the expectations of the educator. So if you expect students, learners, to do well, they will often excel and work harder to make that happen. So it has a lot to do with our own expectations of our audiences. Do we expect that they can do better? How do we say that? How do we work with them and work with that power of expectations? So let's take a little time for some self-examination, because one of the things that happens with particularly women who work in conservation outreach, but also women who are in university research settings, is I'll get some pushback. And really we need to think about, are we really just like everyone else? Because the common thing I'll hear is, well, nobody I know is like that. Well, you're used to looking at what would be a normal population distribution curve. Doesn't matter what's at the polar ends, it's just a distribution bell-shaped curve, you can call it. It is something where we need to start and think about women who are in conservation, who work in agriculture. Who are we? We are already different because we're working in a male-dominated sector. Doesn't mean that we're right or wrong. It just means that we don't represent the whole rest of the population. Neither do the women who have made it into conservation offices. They're not like everybody else because they've also figured out how to navigate a system that is dominated and built by men for men, because that's been our traditional audience. It's not that it's wrong, it's just incomplete. And I would submit that we could reach a lot more women if we think about what the rest of those women are like, if we understand what they need and start to address what they're after. So that brings me back to the institutional gaps. The gaps that our institution of ag conservation perpetuates, because these are things that we can fix. We'll talk a little bit more about media outreach, language and words, programs and planning, and training of staff. And we can fix these. And yes, I know the picture is upside down. It's upside down on purpose. Next time you're in the grocery store checkout line, look at the magazines. Who are they meant for? Look at our conservation publications. Who are they meant for? You can see a dramatic difference. If we think about the media outreach that's out there and the messaging about women landowners, it is almost non-existent. It's almost that we're completely invisible. There have been 2 national media stories in the last 2 years that actually talk about women landowners, and that's the first in many, many years that I've been watching. We can fix this gap if we start looking at the language and words. And Dan did a good job of calling out some things that we say on the inside about NOLOs, non-operating landowners. If we start to change how we're speaking about women who are landowners or landowners in general, it will change how we think about them. Language of conservation reflects one worldview right now, which is exactly where we've been. I'm not saying that it is wrong, it's just incomplete, and we can do better. One of the other institutional gaps is that our programs and planning are also very much gendered, and we don't necessarily realize it because we're so used to it. We're used to the language of it, we're used to how it's oriented, and if you think about it, it's oriented to help men who are farmers achieve what their goals are. And I can tell you that all conservation action is not a straight line, and how we choose to use our brains makes a difference, and we can achieve greater things when we start to recognize that conservation programs don't have to be just one way. They don't have to be in a straight line. And probably one of our better examples of it is our 9-step conservation program planning, our conservation planning. It's very linear, and it's not necessarily the only way to approach it. So one of the other institutional gaps I want to mention is that our training of staff. And if you think about expected staff performance, do we expect our men and women to match each other's conversational styles? I can tell you that women who work in conservation now, whether they realize it or not, they match male conversational styles, or we can't be effective. And do we expect male conservation workers to be able to match a woman's conversational style? Do they recognize it? Do they know how to adapt? So that's all part of serving men and women equally effectively. When we're hiring staff and advancing them, Are we aware of advancement bias? And I would submit that we can do better. And what this happens to hit home with the research angle, and we can stop leaving women landowners out of outreach and research. As I listened to conference presentations, I heard examples, if people brought up women, if they brought them up at all, we only heard about a fairly small number of women who were women farmers who had already made it into the system. We don't know, and we don't hear about the women who are not responding. So we're not addressing non-response bias. We also heard research, and I could tell that the sampling was inadequate to capture the women who aren't already part of the choir. The other thing that is inadequate is we haven't been doing good survey validation. And I will tell you, I have fallen prey to this myself. I wrote questions for a survey, tested them as best I could, thought I had them validated so that whoever was taking the survey understood the question in the same way that I meant it and that they could answer it. And later I found out from a conservationist that his wife had received a copy of the survey and she filled it out on her own, but she had to come to him to ask him about some of the terms because she didn't understand what was being asked. It's difficult to do. We don't work hard enough at it. And I would submit that a lot of the surveys research that we've done can be done better. We can do better and capture more about what's really out there and help women be able to influence their farmers. We've always done that. Even if we're negotiating from a down position, we get things done when we know what to do and how to do it. So I come back to our historic, we've always done it the same way. We can change. We can change now. Some of these things we can change today. We don't have to wait for policies to change. We don't have to wait for somebody to approve it. We can start changing how we think about things. We can think about research differently. We can think about our outreach differently. We can think about publications, the language that we use. And I think the important thing is to start somewhere. We can do better, we can make change, but we have to start, and let's give it a shot. So with that, I'm going to end my part of the presentation, and we'll go back and pick up some questions if there are any in the chat, pick up any for Ed or Dan and I, and we'll entertain questions until we either run out of questions, you all leave, or we leave.
I'll just say, if anyone wants to contact me, I write a newspaper, an economics column that runs at the St. Paul Pioneer Press and some of the newspapers. If you Google me, you'll get my email address.
Okay, so I'll be happy to share my contact information. Let's see, I'm trying to think about the best way to do that. Chris, I'll put it into our internal chat here. And I'll let you take it from there. That's probably the best way to contact me. And there isn't an ag magazine that is tailored for women. There aren't any. It would be great if there was one. So Jan, I'm sorry I can't give you one because there just aren't any. But you can see that our conservation publications are definitely meant for people who are already in the choir. So just to kind of be aware of that. And yes, as far as globally, this is a really interesting thing. There is definitely a distinction between women landowners and women farmers. And most of the international literature talks about land access as an issue. And I'm looking at it and saying, even women who own the land are having gaps. So I would say that it may not even be in the interest of women who farm themselves in countries outside of the United States. If they don't have land access, that may not be the only issue. There may still be built-in discrimination by omission because they're left out. And so that's one of the pieces. So I have combed the international literature from time to time, but most of the time it's an issue of land access. And even in the United States, where women own the land, we don't necessarily get the same kind of respect either still. Michelle's question there. Yeah, campaign to communicate with women landowners, get them, form a network. Women Food and Agriculture Network is one. We have, I worked through them and I helped start several other organizations on their own path to doing outreach to women landowners about conservation. Women Caring for the Land as a program always only addresses conservation in the context of another topic. So it's always got a conservation theme to it. American Farmland Trust started their own program. I did some training early on with American Farmland Trust folks, Pheasants Forever. In Indiana, there's Women for the Land. There are several others that are working on it. So I think there are a variety of things, but a huge conservation powerhouse that is not tapped is exactly right. Women in agriculture in various states sometimes have conservation themes. And Missouri does have good conservation embedded in their Women in Agriculture Conference. And this isn't, there's women have so many needs when it comes to women farmers or women landowners. They usually address other topics. So there are some wonderful programs out there for women. Annie's project does a wonderful job on helping women learn the ins and outs of the bookkeeping and finances of a farm, etc. But very, very few stay focused on conservation and ever talk about women in conservation. So that's a real need. And even in the women in agriculture groups, a lot of times, if women are generating the content for those things, because they know so little, often so little about conservation, or don't find it interesting, or it sounds like too much science, etc., they don't choose those things for their topics. They don't choose and self-select those particular topics. So we as people that are vested in conservation, soil conservation, water conservation, doesn't matter. We're the ones that need to elevate that and start bringing them into the conversation. It's a real challenge. And I think once we start changing how we're thinking, what's going on in our own heads, and how we perceive what difference women can or can't make, I think that's a big deal. So I'm going to let Ed chime in on Annie Binder's comment on about other countries. Go ahead, Ed. You've got great experience in this.
Well, my first job after I had got my master's degree in Ag Econ was on a USAID foreign aid project in Peru. I had lived in Brazil before for a couple of years. And we worked with sheep and alpaca producers, and they were all at high altitudes, but we also worked with the National Ag University, which is on the outskirts of Lima down on the coast. And I had students who worked with me. There were 2 male Ag Econ students and then 2 female animal science students. And the male ag economists from the coast were very good workers, but they really couldn't communicate with either men or women in the Sierra very effectively. But one of the 2, animal science students was from the Sierra, and she was a native Quechua speaker. And she was our link to dealing with the people up in the Sierra because she spoke their first language. But we had long conversations, and Americans can't assume at all that somehow, you know, we're better off than anyone else. In terms of women's roles in agriculture, in many ways, we are worse off because in traditional peasant communities, I think women have very large roles. But there are culturally defined roles in every culture, and there is gender discrimination in every culture. But I think, as you mentioned, in Africa and in South America, there are ways in which women have more decision making authority and within the household than they do here traditionally.
I like Arlene's observation there. I want to draw on Gina Davis and her institute to draw attention to how many women's roles are in movies and how women are depicted in movies. If you draw back to how we're depicting women in our publications, our conservation outreach publications, how many times do we see a woman with her arms akimbo, like in Ed's mother's photo of the nurses? We rarely see women in a very action, I'm in charge sort of pose. We're often depicted in kind of a diminutive, we're looking down at something, or we're standing next to a man who may or may not be a husband, etc. I've seen one photo recently where a woman is actually the one who's actively pointing at a map, and she's the one directing the action in that photo. So having women's images in there, I think, is such an important thing. And we have not been setting the expectation that women and women landowners can take the lead. I've been working with a group of women this last spring and summer who are just absolutely tired. They're just fit to be tied, trying to drag people along with them to get them to do something better, to get them to adopt cover crops. Now they're getting change made because they're being persistent, but they need to work together. And I think that's a really important thing. Go,
Jean?
Dan.
Well, what you're talking about, this reminds me of a story I did some years ago. And this would be a farm family. Mom and dad, I would say, are probably in their 50s. Son went to land grant university, met someone, married, they came back. So in writing the story, I said, well, all right, in this farm, you have the crops, but you also have the beef cattle. Now, it was interesting to me that the older in the older generation, the man had a beef cow herd. It was one breed. Now the young family that came back, their daughter-in-law, she came from a family which had a tradition of raising another breed. And it was pretty clear that there were two herds and there were two breeds, and there were very strong reasons and opinions about the value of that. But when I wrote up the story, the agency person I was relying on, who was very helpful, was just adamant that, well, on this farm, there are 60 animal units. I'm like, nope. It's not just that there are two herds here, there are two dreams here. And so I think that's another thing that's really important to listen to and pick up on.
Thank you, Dan. That's so true. And I just want to shout out Michelle's comment there is so exactly right. Set the expectation. Tell us that we can do something. Tell us that we should do something. Show us other women that are making changes, even in a cash rent situation, even with cost share situation. Some of us can make that difference, and we don't. I mean, we're not all on we're not all alike, just like farmers aren't all alike. But there are some of us who can help, but we haven't gotten engaged yet. We don't know what to do. We're trying to figure it out. We're trying to learn all of this stuff and how to apply it. And we need those expectations put on us that we should step up and that you're counting on us. That's exactly right. It's great. MS ladies are a bit more like Mrs. Lauderman's style when they invited me to speak. Most inherited their land and against expectations decided to farm it. Now these are the ones that were motivated to attend an annual meeting. So they may be the more engaged members. And we need to put them in front of more landowners. So if they are the engaged ones, let's bring them on. Nice
Jean,
comment by Emily. Go ahead, Ed or Dan.
Jean, I think something that you and I have discussed, and I've listened to you because you have the knowledge and the experience in this, but I think that issue of landowners in general, but particularly aging women who own land as placeholders, is really significant. And I think whether we're talking about men or women, families, institutions, that idea of having power and agency and autonomy is really huge. And in some ways it goes back to the story I shared. That's like, we have two dreams here. Yes, collectively for a nutrient management plan for this farm, there are 60 animal units. But if you go to that farm and you're just thinking there's one herd of 60 cows, your credibility is going to go out the window very fast.
Makes a difference. I've just had enough experience with this to know that if we really are successful in engaging women, that we've added to our ability to make change. And it doesn't mean that we're going to create an adversarial relationship between tenants and landowners. The women don't want to disrupt those relationships. They don't want to make that kind of a conflict change. They'd like to support their farmer. They want to help them. They just don't know how. And when it's a cash rental situation, it makes it like, oh gosh, I can't say anything. I can't possibly do anything. Well, of course you can. There's all kinds of things you can do. And we have focused on the variety of things that women landowners can do to make those changes. So, yeah, we can do it. We just have to change how we're thinking about what they can and can't do.
I think another really important point on communications and being specific and using terminology that means something to the listener from their values. The word cover crops is pretty generic. Part of the problem when people hear cover crops, for years in the Corn Belt, we had several states, Iowa included, I believe Indiana, I'm not sure about Illinois. We had this T by 2000 program where the idea was, well, let's get soil loss down to 5 tons an acre or less. That whole idea of tolerable soil loss, I think, really has had a long-lasting effect. And so when people hear cover crops, and the selling point is you're going to cover your land to reduce the erosion, for years people have heard, that's all right, up to 5 tons an acre, you're okay. I think if we were to talk with landowners, especially whether it's an owner-operator or someone who owns the land and rents it out, and say, look, this is really like topsoil insurance, they would get that. Or if you marketed that as a very conservative, prudent wealth management strategy. But I think cover crops is a term that's very generic and meaningless to a lot of people.
Dan, can you put your type your contact information into the private chat button at the bottom if you're able to do that?
I'll do that, and it's also at the end. I see that I didn't advance through my last PowerPoint slide, and that's where it's at. I think these PowerPoints will be up, but I'd be happy to include that. Feel free to contact me. I'm out on the West Coast. If you call at 5 in the morning, just give me a warning so I can start the coffee maker early.
So if you can type that in private chat, then Chris can put it into our comments area. We are at our drawing close to the end of our time together. I want to thank you all for your time and attention. Appreciate communicating with anybody further if you'd like to connect with me directly. Same with Ed and Dan. So if there are other questions, we certainly appreciate your time and attention. Go ahead, Ed.
I just want to say one thing. That when you make an effort in this to change things, you do something for the community as a whole, but you do something for your children. And I learned a lot from my mother. Some things I'm still a little angry about, but she modeled behaviors, and it made me, I think, a better person in terms of trying to change culture and society. Did you hear that?
Your mom, Ed, sounds a lot like the late president of the Columbia Outdoor Sports Company here in Oregon, Gert Boyle. And for years they ran a poster of a very grim, looking you straight in the face, Gert Boyle. And the motto for Columbia Sportswear was "One Tough Mother."
Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Chris, for helping us with all the technology and keeping that going. And thank you to Dan and Ed who've come along on this journey to hold this symposium. So I'm hoping that those of you participants enjoyed hearing maybe a little different perspective from each of these guys to share with you. So thank you very much, and I'll catch you on the rest of the conference.
Great job, everybody. That was fantastic. So
thanks, Chris.
Yep, you bet. Everybody did a great job. This was a fascinating panel, and really, really enjoyed it. So we're still technically live right now. I'm just going to...
excuse me, where do I find private chat to put in my contact info? Because I see like the arrow, the scribe, the pencil. Where do I need to go, Chris?
I'm going to send you a message. Did that pop up for you?
I still see the beginning of my PowerPoint, so no.
Perhaps it would be best to stop sharing, and then you should be able to see my chat. And
let me see if I can put it in.
I wanted to do it. I didn't want to ask you. That'd be like a very gender norm.
It's a tech thing. I get it, Dan. I
just need to keep doing it. And I appreciate your walking me through this, because yesterday I found so many things that weren't not connecting, and Jean was extremely patient. And then for this to go as well as it did, I was extremely pleased. So thank you very much, Chris.
Oh, you're very welcome. Yeah, everybody did a fantastic job, and Jean, you did a great job moderating for sure. So like I said, we are still live. I'll wait and see if we can get that contact information for Dan. I'll put that in the chat, and then I will end the stream. Okay, there it is right there. So let me just put that over.
Oh, way up in the upper. Nope. There are no comments in this presentation. Be the first to add a comment. Is that under comments where I ought to be adding stuff? No, that's add a comment to the slide. Never mind.
That's all right. I've got your contact info there in the chat. So if anybody needs it, they've got it. Yeah, you're welcome.
I really appreciate that.
Absolutely. All right. I'm going to end the stream now, and that will release all of you. So hope you had a good time with this. I know I did, and enjoy the rest of the conference today.
Quick question. When are
Sure.
these videos going to be available?
It takes a few minutes for them to download. I know that the videos from yesterday are available today, so I would say as little as a few hours or as much as a day, but they will be available to replay.
I'm impressed. That's great.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Thank
All right,
you.
thank you.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Chris.